everyone. Welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Tom Fornelli. That's Bud Elliott. I'm Chip Patterson coming to you live on CBS Sports Network. Fired up to hang out with you for the next hour as we look back on Monday night's national championship game. The Ohio State Buckeyes claiming their 9th national title, being the first champions of the 12-team college football playoff era, 10 years after being the first team of the college football playoff era, period. We will also take a look at what's ahead for Ohio State specifically, and also Notre Dame. After what was a very, very strong run for the Fighting Irish. But let's begin with last night. We were live on YouTube with a big breakdown in our instant reaction as soon as the game went final. But, Bud, as you've had some time to settle in, what are some of the big storylines from the game itself that stand out from last night?
Sure, Chip. So I think if you watch this, Notre Dame tried to play a similar style defensively to what Texas and Michigan had successfully deployed against Ohio State. That is, trying to keep two guys back. Now, they played more man coverage, but it wasn't like super aggressive man coverage. They were going to let Ohio State run the ball if the Buckeyes could. Guess what? They could, because Notre Dame's defensive personnel is not quite as good as Texas and certainly not quite as good at Michigan, at least not up front in the front seven. And Ohio State pushed them around, and I think it was like, oh, shoot, like we're in real trouble here. At some point, we're going to have to try to cover Jeremiah Smith one-on-one, which really they didn't have to do until late in the game, and then we all saw that 57-yarder to ice it.
I mean, I think the biggest story from last night's game is the Cinderella story of the title run of Ohio State, the little engine that did not win its conference, that did not beat Michigan, that was able to get through the playoff from the very first round and get to the very end and beat a Notre Dame team that also, another little Cinderella that did not, get a first-round bye, that had to battle all the way through and shock everybody all along the way. Now, I think that this is, if you look at the game last night, I feel like the final score was misleading. Like, there was that late push by Notre Dame that got them back into the game, in which I was very surprised by how they went about doing it, considering what they've been all year. But offensively, this has been a team that has been built around its quarterback run game and its running backs all season long. They're not a team that you wanted dropping back to throw. But in the second half, when they were down multiple scores and you got them uncomfortable and forced them to kind of just be a drop back team, they were sending out a lot of 4 receiver sets and Riley Leonard sitting in shotgun and just kind of picking things apart. And we saw them have a lot of success doing that, particularly with Jaden Greathouse getting Ohio State's defense in man coverage and winning some battles, which was not something I expected to see. But I do think that overall, the right team won. And when I say the right team, I mean the better team. This is an Ohio State team that I think if you look at their season as a whole, the loss to Michigan kind of distorted everything about what this team was all year long. This was always one of the best teams in the country. It was always a team that was going to be in the hunt for a national title. And while it wasn't at peak Death Star every single week of the season, the team we saw lose by a point on the road to Oregon, the team we saw that beat Indiana, the team we saw that stymied Penn State despite the fact that its offense wasn't able to get a whole lot done, that was what Ohio State was. The Michigan loss completely turned everything on its head. But then we saw once the playoffs started and they got Tennessee in that first game at home, the Death Star came back. And they went through one of the most difficult paths you can imagine in a 12-team playoff, having to go through Tennessee, having the rematch with Oregon, going up against Texas, and then getting a very good Notre Dame team in the title game. This is what the 12-team field is going to do from now on. You're not going to be able to fake your way to a national title. You're not going to be able to fake your way to a title game. One of the best teams in the country is going to win the national title every single year. Ohio State was one of the best teams in the country all season long, and they finished the job last night, and they are a very deserving national champion.
Tom, I'm glad you mentioned that because I had to start leaning on the AP Top 25 poll for a lot of my sort of like year in review analysis of this, just because you've even mentioned on the Cover 3 podcast, I don't know if we can totally trust the selection committee rankings, at least in terms of the way that these teams got seeded, because Notre Dame was number 3 in the country in the final AP poll of the regular season, yet they get bumped back to number 5 in the selection committee rankings. Then because of all the convoluted bracketing, seeding, formatting, they get kicked all the way down to number 7. That is the number 3 team in the country, according to 61 AP voters, getting the number 7 seed. Something ain't right about that. Maybe we can have more time to break that down in the future. But I'm glad that you brought up that point about the Buckeyes, because Ohio State all year long prior to the Michigan game was a top 4 team, objectively. They were number 2 for a really long time. They were number 3 for a little bit. They dropped down to number 4, then back to number 3, then back to number 2. After the loss to Michigan, they fall all the way down to number 7, number 6 at the end of the regular season, because we had the number 3, the number 4, the number 5, and the number 6 teams in the country made up your college football playoff semifinals. And so, to Tom's point, we just aren't going to have fluky champions, at least not the way this is set up. We are not going to have teams that have not stacked year after year of talent, because the attrition that we have seen, the way that Ohio State had 24 different offensive line combinations. Donovan Jackson's playing inside, then he's got to kick out. Now we've got to have a new center. I mean, Bud, I think that Ohio State is the blueprint moving forward, where if you want to actually win a 16-game season, a 17-game season, you better have competitive depth unlike anything we have ever asked from title hopefuls in the past.
Chip, or you better stay real healthy, right? Ohio State, I think, is the example of, look, how many times on Cover 3 do we say, man, like, we love this Ohio State team, but like that could be a fatal blow for them for their title hopes, because they just lost the best center in the country. They just lost a likely first or second round pick at left tackle. I think you could still win a national title if you don't have Ohio State's level of talent, as long as you're, like a top 10, top 12 type recruiter, a blue chip ratio team, if you will. But if you're towards the bottom of that, you better have a real dude at quarterback, meaning like not a Will Howard type, but like a guy who's going to go first, second round. And you probably also have to stay real healthy. Ohio State, I think, shows, look, if you're really, really, really a super team, $20 million NIL, great buy and all that stuff, you can lose multiple players who are in the conversation for the best at their position in this sport and still take home the prize.
So, Tom, I had one of those Freudian slips where I said blueprint in Ohio State, and it's because I've got this article pulled up on CBSSports.com, and you can go find it on the CBS Sports App as well. I'm about to dig into it. What did you see when you looked at Ohio State that really brought the blueprint to mind, at least in terms of what other teams might be able to take? Because as Bud mentioned, you're not going to have the $20 million roster. You're not going to have all of this NFL talent assembled. There is an argument we might have seen one of the most talented, I'm not going to say one of the best college football teams, but maybe one of the most impressive collections of raw talent that we have seen in the modern era. So what could other teams take from the title run in and of itself and from Ryan Day and the Buckeyes?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. The formula for winning a national title is really not all that different now as it was in the previous iterations of the playoff and the BCS and before that. The bread and butter of what you do, if you want to build a team that could win it all, is still high school recruiting. And you look at this Ohio State team, yes, there were big name transfers. Will Howard, Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins. But the heart and soul of this team were still guys that were recruited out of high school, who were developed, who stayed with the program, and who were retained. We have seen in the transfer portal era some teams going into the portal and completely revamping their roster, like we saw Ole Miss do it. I think that if you look at that, that is a good way to get to the college football playoff, or at least give yourself a chance to. But if you want to win it, it is still the same formula as before, as Bud mentioned with the blue chip ratio. You recruit the talent out of high school, you develop it, and you keep it. You keep it out of the transfer portal. You keep it out of the NFL. That's what this Ohio State team did. You look at the defense. That whole defensive line pretty much could have gone to the NFL last year. They were convinced to stay. They had a mission. They stuck to it. They worked together for 4 years to achieve it. And even after falling short against Michigan, again, which was one of their primary objectives, was all finally beat Michigan, they still stuck together and they still accomplished the mission of winning a national title. And I think if you look at the other teams that even just came up short, Notre Dame, not really living in the transfer portal. Texas, not really living in the transfer portal. Georgia, not living in the transfer portal. They go to it to supplement their rosters and to fill holes of guys who leave and go to the NFL. But the core of all of these teams are still the recruiting classes that they have built over the years out of high school players. And I think that is the primary takeaway, that if you're trying to win a national title and you're looking at this Ohio State team and you're looking at all these other teams that made deep runs in the playoff, that's the one thing that they all have in common.
Hey, do y'all remember on National Signing Day this past cycle, Ryan Day is at the podium and he finds out officially that Jeremiah Smith's paperwork had come through, and the man nearly collapsed. He goes, "Oh, thank God." Like, he knew how special Jeremiah Smith was. He knew the game, the high stakes battle that had to be done to secure the commitment of a unique player like Jeremiah Smith. And Ryan Day knows, Tom, just like you mentioned, that if you want to win a national championship, you've got to go and get those guys. I went back, Bud, and I watched that clip, and I don't remember who else was in the mix or why there was a delay before all the paperwork came through for Jeremiah Smith, the number one player in the recruiting class. But I really think Ryan Day's knees buckled like he was a groom at the altar who locked his knees too much, and finally, like, everything just gave out and all the pressure was there, because oh my, what that young man meant to the Buckeyes title run. Obviously, he gets the big catch at the end of the game to sort of lock things up as Notre Dame is climbing back. You cover recruiting as intimately as anybody that I know. The Ryan Day's recruiting operation, what does that say about what it means to this title run?
Chip, I remember that well. I think for all of us who cover recruiting, it was like, Jeremiah wants to go to Ohio State. If Ohio State somehow screws this up and doesn't come correct, it would be like Miami or FSU down the stretch. And that did stretch long into the day, but Ohio State came correct. And all Buckeyes fans out there are extremely excited, including Ryan Day, obviously, that they did. Ryan Day is a good recruiter. He's got really good coaches on his staff. But I think they have nice alignment from top to bottom in that organization. I don't expect them to go anywhere. And nowadays, I actually think the era of portal being more important than high school, that it may be over, because now that all these schools have money from the house settlement, guys aren't leaving near as much. The transfer portal this year had a ton of players in it. I don't think it had a ton of studs in it. Honestly, I think the teams kept, for the most part, the players on their roster who they really wanted to keep. And if the talent in the transfer portal is reduced relative to what it was like 2 or maybe 3 years ago, then that's going to place a greater importance on high school recruiting, something Ohio State does really well.
As well as about anybody in the entire country, and a huge part of what got them to their 9th national championship. Well, lots more to get to, but coming up on the other side, let's make a pick. Who is the MVP of the college football playoff for this 2024-25 season? We'll get into all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, they do hand out official awards for the national championship game itself. Most outstanding player on offense, most outstanding player on defense. But a Cover 3 award, one that we can just kind of take because no one else has claimed it, is what about MVP for the entire college football playoff? Now, we had some incredible performance that wowed us along the way, even all the way back to the first round, the quarterfinals, Camp Scatterboo, even in a losing effort, and the Peach Bowl comes to mind. But if we're going to name one MVP for the whole college football playoff, Tom, who you got?
It was not a very easy decision for me. I think that when you look at Ohio State's run, there are a lot of players on this team that played a huge role in where they ended up. I think Will Howard was great for them in all 4 games. I think Jeremiah Smith was a key factor. Even if he didn't have huge numbers in every game, he made the most important catch of the game, I think, in the title game. I think Trevion Henderson had huge moments. I think JT Tuiomaloau had huge moments. I think Donovan Jackson, the freaking left guard who became a left tackle and was suddenly one of the best left tackles in the country, deserves a lot of credit. But I'm giving mine to Jack Sawyer. I think that if you look at what really spurred the Ohio State Buckeyes in this college football playoff, it was the emergence of a front seven that we talked a whole heck of a lot about during the offseason, as I mentioned in the last segment, about how they retained all these guys, kept them from going to the NFL. And we saw there was like a lot of hot and cold, like to this unit all season long. Some games they looked absolutely unstoppable. Some games they were just kind of chilling, doing their jobs and not really balling out, but still being effective. The playoffs started, and against Tennessee, they were absolutely on fire. They were crushing that Tennessee offensive line. The Oregon game comes in the Rose Bowl, and they were playing with their hair on fire again, destroying one of the best offensive lines in the country. Last week in the semis against Texas, Cameron Williams, he'd been kind of banged up. Jack Sawyer looked at that, saw blood in the water, and just went after him all day long. I don't think there was a snap in the game in which Williams won. I think he was 5 yards in the backfield immediately every single time they snapped the ball on offense. And then last night, Sawyer did not have the best game of anybody on the defense, but he did his job. He wasn't really being pressured to go after the quarterback as much as he was supposed to keep Riley Leonard in the pocket. And I think you look at the stats, he finished with 3 sacks. He had 4 passes deflected as a defensive lineman, just getting his hand up, batting passes down. And who will ever forget the forced fumble against Quinn Ewers in the red zone that he then scooped up and ran the longest 80-yard dash in the history of recorded sport as he put the touchdown to put the game to bed and send the Buckeyes to the national title. Again, I think there are a lot of really deserving players, both on the Buckeyes and everywhere else, who had excellent performances in this postseason. But for me, I think Jack Sawyer just embodies everything that this Ohio State team was trying to be in the 2024 season, and he helped. If without him, I don't think they win a national title.
For me, it's Jeremiah Smith. It's the guy who said, yeah, Notre Dame, you can play man coverage, but it's really more like boy coverage the way you're playing. It's not man coverage, right? Because you're playing off, you're playing soft. I mean, Will Howard is 15 of 17 through 3 quarters, and we were sitting in our group chat. He hasn't made a single difficult throw already because it's just so wide open underneath because they're so concerned about Jeremiah Smith. And then when Notre Dame had to have a stop, they had to turn up the aggressiveness. They had to go one-on-one. Christian Gray, who's an excellent corner, like guy who's going to play in the NFL, Smith cooks him. 6 yards wide open. Like the throw from Howard's fine, but most college quarterbacks are going to make that because he dusted him. So I think it's the guy that changed how every defense has to play Ohio State. I'm going Jeremiah Smith.
So I was going to go Quinshon Judkins. I was going to go Travion Henderson. I thought I was going to get a little cheeky, take a page out of DK's playbook and, call it like Travion Judkins or Quinshon Henderson, just sort of identifying those two. But then I decided to get a little bit even more outside the box. I think it might be Chip Kelly. I think it might be the offensive coordinator who took those 22 days off from the loss to Michigan to the first round opener against Tennessee and did a lot of self-scouting and did a lot of soul searching and got that team together, because the game plan that he put together against Notre Dame last night and a lot of what was done, especially in the first 2 wins against Tennessee and against Oregon, was just simply setting up the super talented offensive players to go make plays. You mentioned the difficult throws or the lack thereof for Will Howard. Chip Kelly made it really, really easy on Will Howard. You think about the way that he was able to balance Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, have them play off of each other, have them each also be a factor in the passing game. He gave defenses so much that they had to look at, so much that they had to be concerned about, that things got easy for a team that it seemed like throughout the season was reluctant to push the easy button. So my MVP is that offensive coordinator who now gets a national championship, even if it's as an assistant. He is one of the great offensive minds in football of the modern era. And I think that the things that he did to help Ohio State win in the playoff were not overly complicated. They weren't like breaking everyone's mind. It was just setting up your super talented players to go out there and make plays and make it easy on them. So I'm going to say Chip Kelly was my MVP for the college football playoff. Well, coming up on the other side, time to spin things forward. And before we give you our way too early, let's focus on the immediate future for both of the teams that were playing on Monday night. What's next for Ohio State and what's next for Notre Dame? and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, there is literally no time to be able to sit and just revel in success. Not when you're the Ohio State Buckeyes. No, it's already eyes on next year, where Ohio State is expected to start 2025 as one of the top teams in the entire country, where the conversation about a repeat or running it back will be very prevalent. Now, we know that you're going to have another year of Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. You could argue those are two of the best players at any position in all of college football. However, you are going to be seeing a mass exodus of many of the important contributors who played a role in this Ohio State national championship run. All of those players that were draft eligible last year who decided to come back, the seniors on both sides of the ball, and some of those transfer portal additions like quarterback Will Howard, who will be moving on. So, Bud, when we're thinking about the Ohio State depth chart and when we're thinking about the way this team is going to look on the field moving forward, now where are some positions where you're going to be very interested to look to see the next contributor who's stepping up?
Chip, I think on offense, you have to look at the quarterback, right? Julian Sayin, former five-star who they signed last year. It appears they'll probably go with him to be the quarterback for this 2025 season. Maybe unless like somebody decides to not go to the NFL draft or undeclare or pull their name out, Quinn Ewers, if he is still interested in maybe doing that. But Julian Sayin was a really talented guy. I've heard he's looked good in practice. So Sayin operating off his offense could be pretty nice. They lose Ekbuka, right? But you have Tate, you have Ennis. Some of those young guys maybe can step up. But quarterback's going to be important. Although for them, it's not like Howard was even like a top half best player for them on offense.
Yeah, I think when you look at this team going into next year, there's going to be a lot of players who are stepping into roles that they haven't really filled to this point. Like, this was a very veteran football team. We talked about how they were able to retain so many players on defense. Well, they won't be able to retain them again unless Diego Pavia files another lawsuit that gets another couple of years for these guys. They have to go to the NFL. So you look at the defensive side of the ball. You mentioned Chip, Caleb Downs is back. That defensive line, most of those guys are gone. It's going to be interesting to see how they replace what was a very talented and a very veteran unit. But as we have talked about, this is a program that has done an excellent job recruiting the high school level. You have confidence that while they may not be experienced, the guys who will be replacing Jack Sawyer and JT Tuiomalau and Tyleek Williams will all be very talented. We saw them in flashes, even if they weren't playing the predominant amount of snaps for the Buckeyes this year. We saw them rotate in. We know that they're good players. So it's going to be on them to kind of take over the role as starters for themselves and maintain the level of this defense, which was one of the best defenses in the country. We kind of get lost in the fact that this offense was phenomenal and they have Jeremiah Smith and they have all these weapons, and ignore that this defense was also one of the best units in the country and was also one of the primary reasons this team was holding that trophy up at the end of the night last night. So I want to see what they do on defense. I do think that regardless, this will still be a top 5 team in the country next year. They just recruit to that level. They have the coaching staff. They have the talent. They also have a schedule that I think that comparatively, you put it on the level of the context that this is the Ohio State program we're talking about. I don't think the schedule is too difficult next year. I think that this is a team that should still very much be in the hunt for a Big Ten title, be a favorite for it, and also, no matter what, a favorite to reach the college football playoff again.
Yeah, that's why I think I'm finding myself stopping short of jumping all in on the repeat. That's why I think I find myself stopping short on imagining that after this 16-game marathon title run, you have a drain. You have a drain of the actual players that were there, all of those seniors and all the experience that they had. You've got a drain of those high-end players. Like, yes, you do get the very, very best back, but how many times was it Emeka Egbuka or Henderson or Judkins or Howard getting it done with his legs at times as well? I just think that there are going to be so many new players in new roles that expecting that Ohio State's going to be able to just maintain that level feels very unrealistic. And then I'm also not going to drop him further than like X level. And Tom, you mentioned top 5. Like, it's just you're too daggum talented. And when you start comparing them to the other teams that are occupying space in the top 10, therefore you're a top 5 team. Therefore, the expectation is you're going to compete for a Big Ten. However, that is life as an Ohio State football player. Tom, is that fair to think that with all of that turnover, expecting a back-to-back, the likes of which we have only seen a few times in the modern era, is something that is maybe just a little bit too much to expect?
Oh, it's more than fair. I mean, I think regardless, like if you look, if this is a team that had a ton of returning production coming back, they would again be the favorite to win it all next season. But I think one of the byproducts of this expanded playoff field is, while we will still see the same blue blood kind of programs winning national titles year in and year out, it's going to be extremely difficult for anybody to repeat as a national title in this era, because you've got to win so many more games to do so, and you've got to get through such a more difficult postseason, opponent list to get there. So I think regardless of what's coming back, asking them to win a national title again next year is asking a lot. That said, it's still Ohio State. They are still one of the premier programs in the sport. They have still won more games than any other program in the history of the sport besides Michigan. They have still won more national titles than anybody besides Alabama in the modern poll era since 1936. They will be in the hunt. And if they do win a national title again next year with a mostly new roster, we have to start talking about Ryan Day as being one of the greatest college football coaches of all time, because that would be a hell of an accomplishment.
I agree with Tom on that. My worries for Ohio State are more along the lines of scrimmage. Ultimately, they have not recruited offensive line, defensive line quite as well as maybe they did under Urban Meyer. At some point, does that kind of come up and bite them? I guess we'll see. This year they were able to kind of survive it when they had injuries with Jackson. I'm also worried. Like, I don't think you're going to have bad leadership, but a lot of the guys you're losing, Egbuka and Jackson, and like Jack Sawyer and those guys, those were dudes who went through it. Like they lost to Georgia in 2022, right? They lost to Michigan. Like they had some real some real care about them. And I'm not trying to say the new players won't. And certainly Ohio State is going to have, we talk about all the talent being spread around in this sport and how, okay, everybody's got talent now. Everybody does not have Jeremiah Smith. Everybody does not have Caleb Downs. But Ohio State's going to have to find new leaders who like really care about this and like have college football matter to them.
Jack Sawyer's leadership, Tom's MVP, was tremendous. I mean, it was a huge part of bringing that locker room together and being able to get them ready for a playoff run, Ohio's own, and now a national champion. From the Ohio State Buckeyes to the runner-up in this season, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. What's it look like on the depth chart? What's it look like at quarterback? And is Marcus Freeman going to enter next season with expectations of getting right back to where they were this year? All that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, we've taken a look ahead at Ohio State and the path forward, but what about the Notre Dame Fighting Irish? Tom, when we look at Notre Dame, there's going to be obviously a question of replacing Riley Leonard. But, buddy, you look elsewhere on this depth chart, whether it's on the offensive line, defensive line, especially in the secondary on defense, there are a lot of underclassmen that are going to be back for Notre Dame. So I'll let you take your pick here. Is it the young talent elsewhere that has already shown up, and a Schuler, a Moore, a Gray, that are like proven themselves on a big stage against good teams, or is it intrigue about the quarterback position that has you most interested about where Notre Dame moves forward from here?
I mean, I look at this Irish team going forward, and if I am a Notre Dame fan, like obviously I'm a little down after last night, but I am still very optimistic about where this program is under Marcus Freeman and where this program is going to continue to go, because we talked about it in the last segment. Ohio State's got to replace a lot of these guys. There will not be a lot of returning production on that team next year. Plenty of returning production coming on this Notre Dame team. It was a mostly young team with a lot of star players, and we talked about it on the reaction show last night. The one thing that really stands out to me about this Irish team is that offensive line is going to be phenomenal next year. We saw that Charles Jagasaw was their projected number one left tackle that had to replace the great Joe Alt going into the season. He goes down with the injury shortly before the year begins, meaning they have to throw another true freshman at left tackle with no experience there in Anthony Knapp. Knapp spends the entire season playing left tackle, maybe not all-American level, but for a kid who has absolutely no experience, he did a pretty dang good job. And you're sitting there thinking, wow, the future's bright for this guy. Then Knapp goes down in the playoff, and in steps Charles Jagasaw back to his, spot where he was supposed to be in last night's national title game. And he's going up against JT Tuiomala, one of the best defensive lines in the country, and he had a great game. And you look at the future of that unit, like Bud, you talked about it when we were talking about Ohio State. There are questions about what Ohio State's going to look like in the trenches next year with all that they have to replace. I have no questions about what Notre Dame has to do on the offensive line next season. I think that you can wonder what the quarterback spot's going to look like, whether it'll be Angeli or whether they will go in the portal and find somebody, or maybe it'll even be Lloyd Carr's grandson. But I look at that offensive line, and I know that no matter who is at quarterback for that team next year, this offense is still going to be good because they will be able to block any single play that you call and give them the opportunity to succeed. So if I'm the Irish, I look at that part of my team, and I look at the schedule that, granted, more difficult than the schedule they face this year, but it is not an obstacle that cannot be overcome. You have games against Miami, A&M. You've got the USC game, but they are still going to be favored dang near every single week that they play. This is a Notre Dame team that I think will once again be right back in the college football playoff a year from now.
Tom, I fully agree with you. I think if you look at this Notre Dame team, they're going to be different because whoever plays quarterback, unless they go to the transfer portal, is not going to be a runner like Riley Leonard was. But you get Faison back. You get Greathouse back. Guys who helped them come back last night against Ohio State. It's going to be more of a passing team, probably more of a hard play action team with Jeremiah Love and that offensive line. And for a long time, we talked about the Notre Dame receivers being a weakness. I don't think that they were a great strength this year, but they were no longer like a serious Achilles heel of that team. They were good enough to beat Penn State, right? They were good enough to win a heck of a lot of ball games this year, whether it's Angeli or whether it's Carr at quarterback replacing Riley Leonard. They're going to pass more. Defensively, they do lose some important guys. Like Watts is a real guy. Riley Mills,
yes,
when they did not have him in there, that's a pretty big deal. So we'll see how they can replace some of those dudes. But at corner, I feel great. At backer, I feel great. Edge rusher, I like a lot. 44 off the edge, whose name I can't pronounce. I'm not going to butcher this on CBS Sports Network. That guy's a beast. So they've got a lot of really nice players coming back. I think Notre Dame will definitely start top 10 again.
All right. So I do have to go a little bit further down than I was thinking to go and find him. Jeremiah Love for the Heisman? Is that good? I think that if you've got all right, you've got a player who ran for 100 yards for 12 games in a row in this season. He was a model of consistency. He was overlooked and he was underrated because so much of this season was occupied with looking at Ashton Genty and celebrating what he was able to do in terms of chasing Barry Sanders' record. But Jeremiah Love, and you mentioned we're probably going to have a little bit of a different offense if we change quarterbacks, especially if we keep it in-house. But I am really excited to see. He didn't have a great performance in the title game. He was banged up throughout the college football playoff run. But with a full offseason to get ready for his true junior year behind that offensive line, I would not be surprised at all if we see Jeremiah Love as one of the great stars of college football heading into 2025. So, checking it out on FanDuel Sportsbook, where you can make every single moment more. Plus 5,000. Listen, that might be a little bit of value. You could be sitting on something right there. But Notre Dame, without a doubt, in great hands with Marcus Freeman, a coach who has changed the way that outsiders judge him, and a coach who has definitely solidified the culture of that Notre Dame locker room, as made evidenced by their relentlessness, their resiliency, and their next man up mentality. Well, speaking of 2025, yes, Tom?
I was just going to say, but it is Junior Tuialamaka.
There you go.
There you go.
All right.
There you go. That is your that is Tom delivering with that next man up mentality. Marcus Freeman would be oh so proud. Okay, coming up on the other side, we are going to get into the 2025 outlook, not just for Ohio State and Notre Dame, but for the top teams in the entire country. Where do the Buckeyes and the Fighting Irish sit on our way too early top 10 lists? We'll get into all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, the national championship was last night, which means it's already time to start ranking teams. No, not from the season that just finished, for the one that's going to start in about 140 some odd days, because that's just the way that we do things. But we do have a lot of the information that we're going to have, with most of the recruiting classes getting solidified in the early signing period, and a lot of the transfer portal action, as Bud mentioned earlier, maybe not being as landscape shifting as we would expect now that a lot of teams are able to utilize NIL to secure their best players and avoid that type of bleeding out, especially for the teams at the very, very top. And the very, very top is where we are going to have our focus. So, Bud, why don't you take us through your way too early top 10 for 2025?
All right, the Bud Elliott super official way too early top 10 for 2025. We are starting at the top. Number one, the Ohio State Buckeyes. They lose a lot. They don't lose Downs. They don't lose Smith. I don't know anybody covers Smith, and Downs is an eraser. Number two, Penn State. You get Drew Aller right there. Get a whole lot of guys back. Both backs are back. I think that could be a really special Penn State team. Georgia still has a lot of young talent that was not draft eligible. I think they'll have some improvement on the offensive line. So they're there. 3, Oregon. I like a lot of what they have coming back. Texas, ditto. Texas was higher for me, by the way, before they had that big exodus to the draft, including both starting tackles. Clemson at 6. Probably not like a legit top 16 this year, but they bring back so much. I'm projecting a little bit of improvement there. Notre Dame 7. Honestly, I could have had Notre Dame anywhere between like 3 and 9. So 7's kind of splitting the difference. Kansas State, I think they'll take a nice jump this year. That's maybe an outlier with somebody else's rankings. LSU and then Tennessee. Some of this SEC stuff at the end is going to be interesting. People are going to have, as we'll see probably with y'all, maybe some different SEC teams. But that's going to be one of the big questions of the season. Which of these young SEC quarterbacks actually becomes a stud? Like a real stud, not a theoretical stud.
My top 10 looks a little different than yours, although I do want to point out the most important thing here is that this is way, way too early to be putting together a top 10 for next year. But hey, we're here, right? My number one, just like Bud's, is Ohio State. When I went through the exercise, like part of it, I'm sitting there like, I don't know who the number one team will be to start next year, but I know which team just won a national title 24 hours ago. So I'm just going to throw them there and wait until somebody knocks them off. Texas, I understand your questions, Bud, about their offensive line, but we saw some injuries on that line in the postseason, and guys like Goolsby and others who stepped in looked pretty dang good. And I think Sark's done a very good job recruiting that position. You throw in some Arch Manning, and I think that these Longhorns are going to be pretty dang good again next year. Penn State, we talked about it earlier, how Ohio State's got to replace a lot of guys. The Nittany Lions have lost a couple receivers to the transfer portal, but hey, they were never part of the offense anyway. So I still think Penn State's going to be pretty good next year. Notre Dame, a lot of returning players. We've already talked about it. I expect them to be one of the best teams in the country. Georgia's Georgia. Oregon's Oregon. Clemson will have plenty of experience. Cade Klubnik could prove to be one of the better quarterbacks in the country next year, which will give them a shot to compete. Miami getting Carson Beck. If he's healthy, I think that they have a pretty solid spot and pretty – compared to other teams, fewer questions at the quarterback position with Beck. I think defensively they have upgraded at the defensive coordinator. They've really revamped their secondary. I think we'll see big steps forward. LSU is still super talented, and I've got Illinois at 10, and you might just think it's a homer thing, but it's a program that won 10 games this year and has 90% of its starters coming back next season. Any other program does that, we're looking at them as a top 10. Illinois is doing it. I'm looking at them as a preseason top 10 team.
Oh, yeah. Tom hitting them with a, if that I was an M, you would never doubt it kind of logic on that one. No, I don't hate it there. Speaking of M, let's take a look at my way too early top 10 for 2025. I, again, am putting Ohio State at number one, but it really feels like number one's probably blank, at least for right now. We'll have a little bit more time to get a sense for the kind of turnover that Ohio State is ultimately going to face, but I will have them at the front of the line. for the Texas Longhorns, it is, as you mentioned, Tom, a lot about the fact that Steve Sarkisian has recruited the lines of scrimmage so well that they were even sustaining injuries on the offensive and defensive line and being able to maintain their place in the SEC championship and the college football playoff hunt. Penn State is all about bringing back those key veterans from this year's team that made it all the way to the semifinals. What you get not just from Drew Aller, but from Katron Allen, from Nick Singleton, from Denai Dennis Sutton, should be pretty major. Georgia is Georgia, kind of as you said, but I am very curious to see what ends up happening at the quarterback position and whether or not this Bulldogs team can become a running team again. That ground game was a weakness this year compared to what we've seen from those title teams. They need to solidify that if they want to be able to maintain their top 5 status. Notre Dame sitting there at top 5 feels the stickiest to me, a team that I think will be around that spot throughout most of the season. LSU at 6, I will admit that is a big, big bet on them being able to fix some of their issues on the defensive side of the football, and also on us getting the best of Garrett Nussmeier when he gave us a little bit of an up and down season. Oregon, you stack so many classes like that year over year, I'm going to respect it. Clemson, as you mentioned, Cade Klubnik is going to be maybe one of the most anticipated, quarterback seasons that we will have in the entire country. Then both of the teams that we saw face off against each other on New Year's Eve, Alabama and Michigan. For Alabama, I'm going with Austin Mack as my projected starter there, and a bounce back for a team that had a path to the SEC championship game if they could only, have one forward pass completed in Norman against Oklahoma as a double-digit favorite in a 24-3 loss. And then finally, my big bet, the Michigan Wolverines. I'm going to fast forward them all the way to number 10 because you know who opted out of the bowl game against Alabama? A lot of key Michigan players. Do you know who opted in? A lot of key Alabama players. And when Michigan's backups were pushing around Alabama's starters, then that says to me that the future of the Wolverines is bright, especially when you consider the addition of Bryce Underwood. But any let's see, you can pick apart a Chip list, a Tom list, any team there that stand out to you. Looks like Tom's already gotten his explanation for Illinois. I will accept that for sure.
I think you got to be really careful not to criticize other people top 25 in this day and age when the talent across this sport is so spread out. Like I'll ask you guys, where on your list we're like, okay, this team can no longer be number 1. Like my group of teams that I thought about putting 1 has ended because mine was down to like 7 or 8, and then like 8 to 40. Literally 8 to 40 is very kind of interchangeable. You can make a lot of arguments. I mean, Michigan, Illinois, great arguments there. What do you do with Arizona State? What do you do with BYU? Like, what do you do with Florida? What do you do with South Carolina? Like, all these teams that, like, some of them weren't great this year, but they showed some flashes. Like both those teams in that Cheez-It Bowl that I went to that, Tom's Illinois fighting out, like, they won. There's so many interesting teams out there, but I think the talent in the sport is so flat now because everybody really feels they have a chance because they do. Because everybody's a little more even.
Yeah, I would much rather fill out a way too early tiers list than I would a top 10. Going along to your point, like there were 6 or 7 teams. I was like, if somebody throws them at number 1, I could listen to an argument. Like we mentioned, like Chip, you have Oregon at 7. I have them at 6. I think, Bud, you had them at 6. This is still an Oregon team that's got plenty of questions coming back next year. But the only 2 teams they've lost to in the last 2 seasons are a Washington team that lost the title game and an Ohio State team that won the national title. So this is still a very good Duck squad. I just think that this is one of the nice byproducts of the transfer portal and the NIL era is that we have a lot of good teams. There are a lot of questions that are going into next season, and I think it's what's going to make the 2025 offseason heading in so much exciting because we really don't know.
But come and try and figure it out with us. The 2025 offseason with the Cover 3 podcast, we will continue to be live at youtube.com/cover3. We will continue to deliver regular podcasts. Summer School will take you around the country with all the updates from teams from East Coast to West Coast and more. Scan that QR code on the screen and download the Cover 3 podcast wherever you get your podcasts.